Welcome! In this series of videos, we will cover the design and implementation of a project, from initial design through coding and development to testing, using the PowerBasic Windows compiler. Today we will continue our project to create our own web browser by adding support for images within tables. This was our application at the end of the last video. This will be the 17th edition of this particular project to build a Lite browser. In working on this project, I've developed an increased admiration for those developers who worked on the early web browsers. It's only while trying to replicate the functionality of the early and later browsers that you appreciate just how much work those developers must have put in to get all this to function correctly. However, in this video we're going to be tackling two tasks within our browser. The first task is a bug fix. I've created a new page called page 8, and if we drag that in, we'll see what we're going to work on. The first thing is the paragraph text here is not folding round to the following line, as paragraphs should do. So that is a bug with paragraph handling. So we're going to fix that one first. Once we have that out of the way, we're going to look at the ability to put images within tables. We have a small table here with two columns, and how this should look is like this. The first column has images in it, a plus symbol and a symbol of one of our NAS computers, and the second column has text within it. As you can see from our browser, it's not handling it terribly well. The column headers are not appearing correctly, and the images are appearing as text in the boxes and as images below the table itself. So let's fix the bug first. Let's have a look at the code. Much of the work of the rendering is done inside the render HTML tags function. In here we handle each of the HTML tags. So we can see there is a section which handles the start of a paragraph tag. And all the work is done in a function called printData. So this is the function we're going to have a look at. The purpose of this function is to work out where on the graphics control the data is going to be positioned and then printed. And further down in that function is the section which handles the actual printing. This is our graphic print statement, which prints the text on to the graphics control. Now at the moment it's making no attempt to see if the text is actually wider than the graphics control itself. So this is where we're going to have to put our changes in to handle the correct folding of a paragraph to make sure it doesn't overrun the size available on our graphics control. So there are going to be two sections of the code here, based on the number of BR tags there are. The BR tag in HTML simulates a carriage return line feed in an ordinary text file. It puts the data down to the next line. So where we pick up this value here, the long variable which stores the number of breaks, we can then test to see whether there are or aren't any line breaks. So if the value of that variable is 1, then there are no line breaks. So we're going to put a new section of code in here to handle this. And next we're going to work out, is the text actually wider than the graphics control? If it's not wider than the graphics control, then we don't need to do anything fancy other than just print the data. So we're going to use the graphics cell size command and the graphic get client command to allow us to work this out. The graphics cell size command works out the size of a text character in the font we're currently using, and would save the width and the height to two variables, which we'll declare in a moment. Then we can determine the size of the visible client area. As you will probably remember, we're using a virtual graphics control to control our web page, which is wider than what's visible on screen. However, the graphics get client will give us just the visible parts, and we will save that to two variables to determine the page width and the page height. Next, we will work out the maximum number of characters we can have on a line, which is basically the page width divided by the average width of a character. If the length of the data we wish to print on our screen is actually greater than that value, then there are too many characters for a single line. As the section of code below this handles the br command in the middle of text, we're going to use this section of code to insert new br commands. But first, we have to work out how many characters can actually fit on the line we're on. And we're going to use the graphics split command, which is inbuilt to PowerBasic, to allow us to easily work that out. So we're going to be using another new variable, which we'll call new data, which we're going to build up, and this new data will contain what's going to go onto the line. So we're going to do a loop here, because there may be a great number of characters on our line, and we want to break this into multiple rows. So this is going to be a do loop, and we'll use the graphics split command with the word option. What graphics split does, it takes a number of parameters. It takes the data containing our whole line, it takes the width of the page into which we wish to print, and it outputs to two variables. The print data, which will contain all the text that we can display on that section of the page, and anything left in str data is pushed into another variable, which we're calling overflow. So print data will contain what we can print, and overflow will contain what is left. So now all we need to do is to build up our new data. So new data equals what's currently new data plus what's in print data. Plus we're tacking on to the end of that the br command. We're incrementing the number of breaks, and we're putting what's in the overflow into the data variable. So the data variable will get smaller and smaller until there's nothing left in it. And at that point, we can exit our loop. And after we exit the loop, we can then populate the data variable with what sits in new data. Remembering that new data now has one or more br characters to break up the lines. And as we'll see from the code underneath, the breaks variable will now have a value greater than 1, and it already handles br characters. So we've created a number of new variables within this function, which we will have to declare at the top of our function, as we have done here. So let's now test the application to see if we've done enough to fix the problem with the paragraphs. So if we drag page 8 onto the screen, and we can now see our paragraph is now folding down to the following lines. So where it was appearing as one line before, it's now appearing as 3. So if we reduce the size of our browser and then redisplay it, it should now fold down to even more lines. It's not absolutely perfect, but it's considerably better than it was before. So I think we'll leave our paragraph code as it stands for the moment, and we'll move on to look at embedding images within tables. As we can see at the moment, we are displaying the images, however they're outside the table, and the text inside the table is the image source command, which should not appear as text. So I think there's probably 2 changes we need to make to the main code. So let's go back to the code and see where we need to make changes. So let's have a look at the render HTML tags function. As we saw, the image command text is appearing inside the cell of the table. If we have a look to see where the image tag is actually handled, there's a test in here to see if we're actually inside the body of the HTML. I think we need another check here to see if we're actually inside a table tag. As we did in the previous videos, the table is handled in 2 stages. The table tags are built up in a build table function, and then are displayed in a display table function. So in there, I think we can set a boolean to say that we're actually inside a table. And we can do that like this. We're going to create a new variable called inTable, which will either be true or false. And the image tag will only be handled if we are actually not inside a table. So we will create that new variable at the top of our code, and we'll need to populate that when we're building up the table from the table tag. So there is a new variable at the top of this function, which will either contain true or false. So now we have to populate this variable when we're handling tables. So if we look further down the code in this function, we should find the section of the code that handles tables. And we can populate that function in here to say we're now inside a table. Once the table tag has finished processing, we will have an end table tag, and we'll need to turn this variable to false. So we will add on a new case statement to handle the end of tables. So now we're going to have to make some changes to the build table function to handle embedded images. This will involve at some point handling an image itself, loading it up and displaying it on the graphics control. So there is some information we're going to have to pass to the build table function. We're not currently doing so. And that comprises 3 variables: the handle of the dialog, the tab number, and is this a web page or not. Today we're only going to be adding images into table cells, but there will always be the possibility that we will need to handle images inside tables which are in themselves a URL link. And we'll need to know whether the image is coming from a web page, i.e. a web server, or it's a local file, hence passing the isWebPage variable. So let's now go to the build table function and make changes in there. So here we are at the header for the build table function, taking its current 2 parameters. So we will now add on the 3 extra parameters we set up in the previous function, which calls this one. So before we go any further, let's run the application to see how far we've got. So if we drag in page 8, we can now see the images themselves are not being displayed. So the image tag section of our case select statement is no longer being actioned, as we want this to happen within the table build function. So we're making some progress. So in the build table function, we're stepping through the string which contains all the data in the table 1 character at a time. In retrospect, this approach is going to cause us some problems. So what we're going to do is we're going to restructure this function completely. So we will name the old function as build table old, and we're going to create a new function called build table. This will allow us to go back to the old function should we find we can't get the coding correct in this new one. So we're probably going to be using most of the same variables, so we'll just slot them in. And I think as we're going to be calling the display image function, we're going to need some extra variables. We need to know the tab that's been selected, we need to know whether we're actually inside a paragraph or not, and we're going to put in the image tag user-defined type. We will not today be putting in any images which have embedded links, but that will be something happening in a later video. So as we did in the previous function, we need to get all the table data using our function getTagValue, which gets everything up until the end of the table tag. Having got that far, we need to count the number of headers and columns, which we did in the previous function as well. Next, we need to work out what's the maximum number of columns in this particular table. And do we have any header columns? This information is going to be held in 2 arrays, one for the table and one for the table colors, because in previous videos we've handled putting background colors on cells within a table. In the previous function, we used a for next loop to step through our table information 1 character at a time. We're going to do something a little different here. We're going to actually look at it 1 command at a time. So I'm going to change this from a for next loop to being a while loop. And we're still going to use the t variable to work out where we are in the string of characters. And we will continue this loop until we get to the end of the information within our data variable. The first part of the code here is going to be exactly the same as before. We're going to be picking up the character we're currently sitting on. If this character is an open angled bracket, then we know we're on the start of a tag. So we're going to pick up the command from there and store the last command should there have been one. So this code is unchanged from the previous function. Next, we will capture the attributes for this particular command. Again, this is unchanged code. Trimming the command to remove any attributes, so we have just the command itself, we can now use a select case statement to actually work out which command we're dealing with. Again, this section of the code is where we'll start to diverge from the previous function. So here is our select case statement. We're looking first of all for the caption command. Does the table have a caption? And we can use the getTable tag value to pull out the caption data from this point in the string and put that into the caption variable. And this is where we're going to start doing things a little differently. We're going to advance the t variable to the end of the caption data. So rather than looking at this at one character at a time, we've now handled the caption command, so we're moving on to the next command. So what other commands do we need to handle within this section of the code? Well, we know that there are rows in the table, so we'll need to handle the fact that a new row may occur. So again, we're going to copy the code from the previous function, which is unchanged in this section. And the only difference at the end of the code here is to move our pointer to the end of this command and update the t variable. And we will continue with the end of the tr tag. As before, we're setting the column to 0 and we're moving the pointer on beyond the tr tag itself. In a table, we have some table headers, so we're going to have to handle table headers as well. And we will do this in exactly the same way. We will copy the code from the previous function and we will advance our pointer to the end of the table header. And of course, what would a table be without a table data cell? And as before, the only change in this section of the code is moving the pointer on to the end of that command. So now that we've got that far, we should have handled all the commands we need to in this section of the code. In the previous function, the next job, once we've been through all of the data, is to then display the table on the graphics control. And we'll need to do that also in this function. And unlike the previous function, our first task before we call the function displayTable is to pick up the tab that's been selected. And we're going to add on extra parameters to the call to this function. We're passing forward the dialog handle, the tab selected, the in-paragraph variable, and the isWebPage. So we will now go to the displayTable function and add on these extra parameters. So here is the header for our function with those extra parameters, all 4 of them, tacked on at the end. So what changes will we need to make to our displayTable to handle embedded images? We're going to add on 2 local variables to make the task of looking after these images just a little bit easier and to give us a little bit of future-proofing. We're going to add 2 local variables, one for the cell contents, which will pick up what's in the table cell, and a user-defined type image tag, which we will make use of later. The majority of this function is going to be unchanged, but we will have to make some changes when we're actually printing to the graphics control. So in this section here, we're first using the graphics box to print any background colours, and then printing the text on top. So to make this a little easier, we're going to pick up the cell contents from the array. This will allow us to make life easier when we're doing any debugging. So if there is no background colour, is this text or an image we're going to display? So we're going to use an inString command looking for the image source section of code. If that exists, then our cell contains an image file. If not, we can just go ahead and print it. So we already have a function we prepared in a previous video which allows us to display an image on the graphics control. That function is called displayImage. So we're going to slot that function right in. And we will substitute the cell contents for the value held within the table. That makes the code a little bit easier to read. So let's take out the table old function. Let's comment that out completely. to save it confusing the application when we attempt to compile. And our application compiles quite cleanly now. So let's run the application to see if there's any more we need to do. So let's drag in page 8, and we can see we now have the images appearing in the first column. However, we do not have anything in the second column. So let's go back to the code to see what else we need to do. Well, I think we have a problem in the table tag value, which we pass in the start position, and we amend the start position there. So the value that's coming in is being amended by this function. So we'll change this to by val, and we'll try running again. That's much better. Now we're correctly picking up both the first and the second columns. We have the image in the first column and the text in the second column. Our image is slightly blurring into the second column. So I think we have a problem with the determination of how wide a cell is in the table, how wide the column is. That is not determining the width based on the size of the image. However, I think we're fairly close to this, and I think we will leave the determination of image widths to the next video. So in summary, what we've achieved today are two things. We have fixed a bug in the code handling the paragraphs, and paragraphs now correctly fold round to multiple lines if the browser is not wide enough. And in addition, we have now supported the inserting of images into the table cells. There is of course much work still to be done, but we'll leave that for a later video. That's it for today. Thank you for watching.